Hey everybody, welcome back. This week I'm going to try a different way of recording our lecture. The last 2 weeks, what I had been doing was using PowerPoint, and it has a function now that you can record and embed within the PowerPoint. Unfortunately, it took up so much bandwidth of my computer that it was making my computer have issues. So I'm going to try doing this method. So what I'm doing this week is I opened up my own little Google Meet by myself. I created a presentation, uploaded the presentation to Google Drive, which converts it into Google Slides, and then I published it to the internet. And now I'm going to try to go ahead and record this lecture. Would you like to go back to the written ones? This year is the first time that Perusall software has allowed for video lectures. And so instead of updating my old written ones, I've been trying it out the last couple of weeks. So if you all like it, then I may continue doing it, even though it takes a little bit more time. And if you guys don't appreciate it, then I would like to go back to the other ones. But whatever helps you all the best is what I will do. So this week we're going to learn about settings for development. In particular, we're going to focus in this lecture on home and school. The book goes a little bit into detail about community as well. So let's get started. Something I'd like to let you all know is that for this week, I actually have 2 different slides for unit learning objectives. So I split out the home unit learning objectives from the school ones. So you'll see this first unit learning objective slide, and then when we get to the school ones, you'll have some more that you'll need to write down. All right, so our first unit learning objective is I want you to be able to reflect on the 4 parenting styles to analyze the parenting style of the caregiver or caregivers you had growing up. So this may have been a biological parent, but it may have not. It might be an auntie or an uncle or a sibling even, or potentially foster care or adopted parents, or who knows who it may have been. So hopefully by the end of this unit, you'll be able to look at parenting style theory and then use the constructs to determine which parenting style your caregivers had. I also want you to be able to explain what the term resilient outcomes mean and what foundational research brought the topic of resilience to light. I want you to be able to identify the pros and cons of using corporal punishment and other discipline techniques. I want you to be able to list the types of child maltreatment and provide accurate examples of each. I'd like you to be able to identify different family forms and define the structure of each family form. I would like you to be able to explain parental alienation and how it can magnify the negative effects of a divorce on children. So let's get started with the parenting styles. In your book, it doesn't tell you the whole story. I know you're shocked about that, but it actually leaves out quite a bit of the real theory associated with it. So in the theory, it does have 2 constructs that determine what parenting style somebody has. The book called this, I believe it called it love and discipline. But if we look at the actual theory, what we call those 2 constructs are warmth and control. So warmth is affection, essentially, and control is discipline in essence. That's just not the terminology that they use in the theory. So this is being able to get your children to act in a particular way. And so when we look at this theory, Diana Baumrind was the one who developed 3 of these types, while we had researchers develop a 4th type. And so that gets us all the different types of parenting styles that we recognize with relation to parenting styles. So we have 4 of them here. You'll notice in my table that I have high warmth, low warmth. So that's high affection, low affection. High control, which means discipline, getting kids to behave in the way that you want them to, and low control. And so there's 2 of these parenting styles that people often get confused. So if you look in our first row of actual parenting styles, we see that we have authoritative and authoritarian parenting styles, and people tend to get those confused. So by the time that we get done with this slide, hopefully you'll be able to understand and distinguish between those 2 parenting styles. So with authoritative parenting styles, these are parents who have high warmth and affection, and they also have high discipline. Often the word discipline actually has a really negative connotation to it. And so when we talk about discipline with relation to developmental theory, it's not a negative thing. It's just getting someone to behave the way that you want them to, essentially, when we're talking about children. And so a lot of times I think that this word has a lot of negative connotation to it to people because their parents didn't have really great strategies for teaching them the different skills that they needed to do and the different behaviors that they needed to engage in. And so you can have someone that has high warmth, but also has high expectations for the behaviors that their child engage in. And that's what we see as authoritative. They typically think of authoritative as the gold standard for parenting style. It's the best ones, but that's not necessarily true across all environments. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to authoritarian. So let's go ahead and go to authoritarian. With authoritarian, you notice that those parents exhibit low warmth, but they also have high control. So these are often the parents who, it's like my way or the highway, very aggressive sometimes, don't show a lot of affection, but they have really high expectations for the behaviors of the children. So earlier I said that authoritative is typically what we see as the best type of parenting style. It has the best type of outcomes. That may not be true if the children are developing in a really dangerous area. So sometimes there's some research that is supportive authoritarian parenting style when the environment's dangerous and the kid just has to be able to do the things that they need to do to stay safe. So how might you be able to keep authoritative, which is our gold standard, which has high warmth, apart from authoritarian, which is low warmth? What kind of strategy might you use to prepare for the test? So I have a couple different ones that I use. When I think of authoritarian, I think of totalitarianism, which is kind of funky way to remember it, but hopefully that helps me remember that authoritarian are the bad ones, or not the bad ones, but they have the low warmth. And then also, sometimes I tell my in-person classes that the authoritarian has the more A's in it. So it has 3 A's. The more A's, the more of a they are. So hopefully you get what I'm saying there. So it's just the more A's, the less warmth that the parent has. So then we get into permissive. We have high warmth, which is high affection but low control. So these are the best friend parents that shower their kids with love but have no rules for their kids to follow. And so this is the parents that are letting their kids go out and do whatever they want whenever they want. They're the ones hosting underage drinking parties and things like that. And there's a lot of bad outcomes for the children that come from permissive homes sometimes. We also have the rejecting, neglecting. This is where they have low warmth and low control. So they don't really care about their kids, and it's really unfortunate. This is the fourth parenting style that was developed by other researchers than Baumrind. And so with this one, they don't give an affection, but they don't have any rules either. They're just kind of there. So hopefully you can tell these 4 different parenting styles apart now, and you can reflect on this in the comments. We also want to talk about resilient outcomes. So just because you come from a really poor circumstance or bad circumstance doesn't actually mean that you're going to turn out completely terrible. So this kind of is where we talk about resilience research. Your book called people like this person is resilient or resilient children, things like that. Actual resilience researchers would cringe at the fact that our author of our textbook says uses resilience in that way. So typically resilience researchers prefer the term resilient outcomes because it's not as likely to blame a child who's gone through really terrible traumatic circumstances for not being able to pull through and get their life together. So resilience research actually began in Hawaii, and I don't know what people know about Hawaii other than the resorts and things, but in Hawaii, there are some really, really impoverished areas, and it can be a really, really rough upbringing. But that's not the idea or the schema that people often have about Hawaii. They think fun and beautiful sand and the ocean and beautifulness and fun. But there's a lot of really impoverished areas, and I don't know cases, and this may still be going on, where states in the United States would actually fly their homeless populations to Hawaii because they couldn't come back that way. And so there's some really brutal things that the United States has used Hawaii for, with that being one. So in this research, what they found is they had a whole bunch of kids that went through really, really bad circumstances, whether it's parents being in prison, being very, very, very impoverished in dangerous situations. And what they found is that a lot of these kids, by the times that they were in their mid 30s, were not turning out the same way as you would think they would turn out coming from such a really bad circumstance. They had these resilient outcomes. Most of them were employed gainfully, had steady relationships, were keeping themselves out of prison and jail. And so the researchers thought this was really, really interesting. And so this birthed this new research of resilience, where they started looking at, okay, what are the things that buffer kids from having these bad outcomes? And what are the things that contribute to having a bad outcome in a child? And so we look at those as protective and risk factors, which you've probably heard a lot about. And so with this, okay, if you have a kid that's coming from a traumatic home, what are some of the protective factors that they had? Did they get really involved in school so they didn't have to be at home? Did they work really hard at school, or did they have a mentor that mentored them out of that position where they were? And then we look at risk factors too, right? So poverty can be a risk factor for some less than ideal outcomes for people. Did they have an absent parent, or did they have an abusive parent, or did they have a parent who was dependent on alcohol and drugs and all these things that could be potential risk factors as a part of their development? It does not mean that all children who go through these circumstances will turn out terrible. That's definitely not what happens, but there is something that happens along the lines and trajectory where there are certain things that buffer some people, and they're able to pull themselves out of these really bad circumstances and make something of their life. And then there's another set of people where they can't overcome where they came from, their foundation in life. And so again, research prefers the term resilient outcomes because it puts it more on the outcome and not necessarily the individual. Okay, so corporal punishment, from your reading, you know that means that it's punishing using some sort of physical force. So in other words, this is spanking. So what do you think some of the benefits and disadvantages of spanking are? This is always kind of a really big to-do in the in-person class. It's a little bit different discussing some of these things on an online class using the software, but people are very, very opinionated about this. And so they really, really, a lot of times people hate hearing what the research says about spanking. So I'm gonna let y'all talk a minute, and then we will talk here in the video. All right, I think that's enough. Hopefully you paused me so you could write your comment if you wanted to. So benefits. Spanking is not ideal. I will start off with saying that. The things that I'm saying here is gonna not say that spanking is a great thing, and it's not something that I'm gonna say that you should ever do. Because what we know from the research, a benefit is that it stops the behavior immediately. That is the only advantage of spanking. The disadvantages are that people who are spanked tend to be more aggressive than people who are not. We know that that's a correlational research design because we cannot randomly assign children to be spanked or not to be spanked and then see what their outcomes are. But we do see that kids who are spanked tend to be more aggressive. A lot of people are like, well, I was spanked and I'm not aggressive. We're just looking long-term at what the overall research says. So we can reflect on our own experience, but sometimes our own experience doesn't give us the bigger picture. We also see with spanking that it doesn't typically really stop the behaviors. It may stop it like immediately, but what we see kids develop instead are really sneaky behaviors so they don't get caught. And so those are some of the disadvantages. Another disadvantage that we see from the literature is that it does more harm to the parental and child relationship or the caregiver and child relationship than anything. And so we also see that if kids are being constantly spanked and they're not learning from their behaviors, obviously the strategy is not working. All right, so I know this is a hot topic. This is just the quick version of this discussion that could take an entire class period if we had it. So I will try to jump in some of the comments when I run into the perusal software this week. So when we talk about discipline, and I already kind of started this a little bit talking about this in this lecture, discipline is not necessarily a bad thing. And so because many times parents don't have optimal strategies that they can use to parent their kids, often that's a reason why they resort to spanking, or maybe they hadn't learned anything any other way. Maybe that's the only way that they had been disciplined. And so when we think about discipline, we're actually not talking about punishment. Okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about discipline? Put your ideas in the comments. Okay, so discipline with relation to developmental theory just means to teach people to act correctly. Correctly is such a, soft term, because what does correctly even mean? And so that actually would change depending on what family you come from, or what society you come from, or what culture you come from. But discipline is the way that parents teach, or caregivers teach children to behave in a desired way. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it. So again, discipline tends to hold a negative connotation when it shouldn't. And I think a lot of this also goes back into how parents view being a parent and what that means. All right. So when we're talking about behaviors, a lot of time we'll talk about functional behavior analysis because it's really tied into this. And when I work with parents and doing parent training, if I was out in the world working as a licensed psychologist, and now this would be what I do. Parent training is probably one of my favorite parts of working with families. And so when I worked in schools, a lot of times I was the one who would work with kids who brought weapons to school, or who threw the file cabinets across the room, or who are threatening to hurt other people. And so as a part of that, when I work in consultation with families, or I work within school systems, often I'll do something called a functional behavior analysis, okay? So in order to talk about this a little bit more, we got to talk about what is a behavior. So what do you think a behavior is? Define it over in the comments for me. So I'm going to do something in a minute, and I want you all to describe to me how you know I did it. Okay, you ready? How do you know that I just clapped? So when we're defining a behavior, we're defining it as something that we can see or hear. So when I clapped, we know that I clapped because we could observe it. All right. So people get confused about this because often people would be like, that person over there is sad. Well, that's actually not a behavior, right? The behaviors that indicate that a person may be sad might be what? Maybe they're crying. Maybe their face is puffy. Maybe they're slumping their shoulders down. Maybe they're avoiding eye contact, right? Those are behaviors. Being sad is actually an emotion, okay? So when we do functional behavior analysis, we use a mnemonic called ABC to remember the terms for it. So we remember it by antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And we do these things, we use these things so that we can try to determine what the function of the behavior is, or the reason why someone engaged in a certain behavior. So the antecedent, or the A, is what happens directly before the behavior occurs. So often when we're doing an FBA, it's not because we see a behavior that we really love, that we want to see increased. We often see an undesired behavior that could possibly be dangerous to the individual or others around them. So when we're trying to determine what the purpose of that behavior is, we often want to see what happens right before it. And we also want to identify what the behavior is. What is the specific observable behavior? Is it the child is picking up and throwing a desk at a teacher or a peer? That would be a specific observable behavior. And then what's the consequence? What happens directly after behavior? So when we see consequence here, sometimes people get confused and think consequence means, something negative, right? So when we do this, we have to talk about what happened directly after behavior? Well, I ignored the behavior. Well, that is actually doing something. So when you ignore a behavior, that is a consequence, right? And actually, that can be a very powerful consequence depending on what the function of a behavior is. All right. So let's have an example here. Antecedent, the teacher assigned a very difficult homework assignment. Our behavior, little Tommy threw a desk against the wall. So, man, I just noticed that I'm using a lot of examples about desk throwing. I think that's because that is a pretty common thing that tends to happen in schools. So excuse me for my tainted example here. So little Tommy threw his desk against the wall. Consequence, little Tommy got sent to the principal's office. So in the situation, what do you think is going to happen if, there's this really difficult homework assignment? Then we see little Tommy throw the desk against the wall, and then little Tommy gets sent to the principal's office. Was this a good way to handle it, or was it terrible? It was terrible. So if we look at this behavior, why do you think likely Tommy threw the desk against the wall? Likely it was because the homework assignment was difficult and little Tommy got overwhelmed and wanted to escape doing the homework assignment. And so he threw the desk against the wall and then he got his way, right? So what happens in this situation is little Tommy actually just got reinforced to throw desks against the wall, and likely we'll see that behavior increase. And so if I was a school psychologist in this situation and I was going in and doing a FBA for this child, I likely would find a way to still make Tommy do his homework assignment while he's not getting attention from other people and he's not in a position where he would hurt other people. So we would have to find, a lot of times, find something called a replacement behavior so that Tommy stops throwing these desks against the wall, but we'll get to that. Okay, so I kind of got excited and told you all a little bit more about this than I was planning to right away. But we also have something called functions of a behavior, okay? And we talked about this a little bit in the example that I was doing. So our different functions of behavior include different reasons we do. I know you just saw the slide that I got excited and went ahead and went through the animation. But what do you think there's three main reasons why people do every single behavior? What do you think the three reasons or the three functions of behaviors are? Okay, I'll go ahead and put the first one up because I already showed you. It's to get something. What are the other two? If you said to avoid something, you're right. And if you said self-stimulation, you're also correct as well. So these are our three major functions of behaviors: to get something, to avoid something, or self-stimulation. So when we're going in and doing FBA for a family or within a school system, a lot of times what we need to do is figure out what that function of the behavior is. And so a lot of times it could be to get something, like to get attention, or to get anything really. Why'd you steal? So I could get the ice cream cone. I don't know who steals ice cream cones, but maybe somebody does. And so with these functional behaviors, this helps you develop a plan to figure out to help kids either get or avoid or self-stimulation in a way that is more accepted by society. So let's look at some specific discipline techniques. So we have something called a replacement behavior. So replacement behavior is like an alternative to the behavior that you're not wanting to see. So instead of throwing a desk against the wall, we could train little Tommy to raise their hand and ask for help, right? Because if they're raising their hand to ask for help, then they're not throwing desks against the wall. And we could use different things to try to shape that behavior to happen. Let me talk about a situation when I worked for an autism center. And so when I worked there, we had one of my clients kept running across the room and slamming her body down on her knees. And so that was really dangerous because we were really afraid as a medical team that she was going to bust her kneecaps. And so we had to think, okay, what's happening right before, then she does it, and what happens after, right? And then we're thinking, okay, what's the function of this behavior? Why is she even doing this to begin with? And come to find out, she really liked the pressure on her knees. And so we're like, okay, how can we get her the pressure on her knees without her busting her kneecaps open? And so what we ended up doing was teaching her how to press on her kneecaps with her hands, so that she could feel that pressure on her knees, which was self-stimulation, right? That was the function of it, was self-stimulation. And then she stopped running and dropping her knees on the ground. And that was a very easy thing to do. And so when we have these replacement behaviors, we think it's something that's more acceptable or something that's not as dangerous that they can still do. And hopefully it's incompatible with their original behavior. So if she's trying to push on her knees, she can't run and slam her knees the way that she was doing. It was a replacement. So for example, if we have a kid with ADHD and they're like tapping their pen against the wall, we may find like a squish ball that they can use the squish ball instead. So we have a replacement behavior that is more acceptable, less distracting, and they can still kind of engage in that behavior without distracting other people. So that's really huge. Replacement behaviors are huge if you're trying to give something up. So smokers a lot of times will say that the hardest part of giving up smoking is not knowing what to do with their hands. And so sometimes we'll teach people to do that. There's, some estheticians that will give their clients fidget toys. And they say, when you feel like you want to pick at your face or do something like that, you play with this fidget toy instead. So it's incompatible. You cannot pick at your face if you're pushing on this little fidget toy at the same time. And so that can be really powerful. If you're ever trying to kind of shape your own behavior, this might be something that you think about. What could I do instead that won't harm me as bad? We also have the Premack principle, which is one of my favorites. I do this to myself all the time. And with the Premack principle, basically, what you do is you'll do something that's less desirable first and then do something more desirable later. So for example, I might say, I will grade these 60 really terrible Gen Psych papers first, and then I will go have Taco Tuesday with my friends, right? So I'll do the thing that's less desirable. I'm not saying I don't actually even teach Gen Psych, so I'm not calling anyone out. I don't even teach that class anymore. But you do the less desirable thing first, and then you do the more desirable thing later. So what ways have you used that technique in your life? What is something you have to keep in mind when using that technique? Especially if you're doing it with yourself. Hopefully you guys are writing in the comments right now and I'm not just talking to myself. All right, so something you have to keep in mind with that technique, even with children, because this is one that you can use really great with children, is that you hold the people accountable or yourself accountable, that if you don't do that first thing, you can't do the other. So sometimes students will be like, I try so hard to do this, but then I just go watch Netflix anyway, or I still go out with my friends even if I don't get my work done. It takes some discipline, right? These are some strategies that take some practice. With kids, this would be saying you have to eat your vegetables before you get dessert. Yeah, I know food's probably a bad example because of things that they talk about with health and related to using food as rewards. But I think that does really illustrate. First, you have to put on your shoes before we can go play. First shoes, then play. So when you have a really little kid, it's really easy to direct them because you just shorten the words. First we do this, then we do that. And sometimes if you phrase it like that, even if the kid's being kind of defiant about it, a lot of times it'll work. But you have to make sure that you're consistent, or otherwise it's going to cause trouble. Then you start reinforcing potentially temper tantrums and things like that. Planned ignoring, this one's great. So if the function of the behavior is to get or gain attention, planned ignoring is a great strategy. So in the face-to-face class, when it's not COVID year, usually we'll have an example of this. So pretend this is a person in my class acting up. And I have we get really rowdy in class with this, and I have them pretend like they're yelling at me and stuff. And then I literally will just turn my body partially away, and they'll keep doing it. And then eventually it's funny because the student will actually just stop all of a sudden. And then I usually pair that with another strategy that we're getting ready to learn, but then I'll specifically praise them. Oh, I like how you're sitting so quietly and being respectful. But if the tantrum starts going up again, you also then withdraw your attention and you ignore the behavior, because if they're trying to get attention and you give them the attention because they threw a fit, then you're just going to see those behaviors increase because you just positively reinforced their bad behavior. which is never good. You see this in grocery stores, or you used to before COVID, or if a kid was throwing a fit, sometimes people will hand out cookies or try to give a kid tantruming something. Sometimes it's parents, but sometimes it's other people in the community, because people are really bad about being okay with people showing emotion or children crying and things like that. And they're just trying to get the kid to be quiet. But what that does is it actually increases tantrums in children, which can be really difficult. So the second technique that I said that I'd like to pair with planned ignoring is called catch them being good. So whenever we hear about positive reinforcement, a lot of times students will bring up praise, where you praise somebody, where you tell them that they're doing a good job or they're doing a really good job with a specific thing. So whenever we do this, what you do with catch them being good is that you make sure that you use specific praise. So it's not like good child, you've done great. That doesn't teach kids anything. But if you're like, Anaya, I really like how you went and asked for help when you needed it. That was really great. And you tell them specifically what they've done good. So when we're working in schools, a lot of times, the first thing that we try to do is to get people to use these techniques, not just schools. So, technically, I think we're in the family unit right now, but you use them both across the home and school environments. But the very first thing we do whenever we have in a family counseling clinic that I used to work in, strategy we used with all of them, all of our clients, was to get them to catch their kids being good. Right. So by the time that parents came to me, whether it was in that family counseling clinic or it was in the autism clinic, kids were already freaking out. Not kids were freaking out. I did not mean to say that. Families are already kind of freaking out because the relationship is so strained between the parent and the child, or the caregiver and the child, because there's all these behaviors and they don't know how to manage them. Parents or caregivers sometimes take that personally when they shouldn't necessarily. And they're stressed and they don't know what to do. And so what we do in the very beginning is try to reestablish that relationship between the caregiver and the child, by having them catch them being good. And the heartbreaking thing is when you have families who can't think of a single thing that's good about their child or the kid that they're watching or raising. And that's unfortunate, because I think that actually a lot of times says a lot more about the parent than it does the child, if they can't find anything good. And so there may also be issues with the caregiver having to struggle with depression or things like that, where we know with depression, people with depression often view themselves more negatively and view others more negatively, in the world as a whole negatively. So sometimes there may be some things that we have to work on with distorted cognitions or distorted thinking in some of these caregivers as well. So once we do this, once we reestablish that relationship, things start working a lot better for those families. And it's consistently been shown, not only in the research, but in my own practice as a clinician, to be really helpful for families. So I have a challenge for you. I want everyone in this class, once they see this lecture, I want you to go out into the world and I want you to try to not correct or criticize anybody for 24 hours. That is your challenge. Once you do that, I want you to come back into this unit, even if class has moved on to the next week after this. I want you to come back in and tell me how it went. So once you do criticize somebody or try to correct somebody, unless you're a teacher and you're having to like a education major and you're doing your teaching practicum and things like that, if you have to help correct homework assignments, that's something different. But I'm more thinking about, like, if you have a romantic partner, if you have a roommate, if you're at home with your parents, things like that, try to only provide specific positive praise to the people around you for 24 hours. And if you don't, then you restart your 24 hours. And I want to see how this goes for you all. So differential reinforcement then is that pairing between the planned ignoring and the catch them being good. So I kind of already illustrated this for you a little bit. So if we have a kid throwing a tantrum, I turn my body a 45-degree where I can still see them out of the peripheral vision, right? When they stop for a second, I look and I'm like, oh, and then use specific positive praise. If they start tantruming again, I do this. If the function of that behavior is attention, then it will stop it. All right, we also have child maltreatment. When we're talking about child maltreatment, we talk about typically physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. And so you've probably done a lot of work with this. There's really interesting, a lot of studies that there are out there on childhood abuse and how that influences adult development. And so I don't know if y'all have heard of the ACEs study, but that might be something that you would be interested in looking into. Because in the ACEs study, what they're finding is that people who go through abuse may have some higher chances of some really bad health outcomes, where it could be, I believe some of them was diabetes even, and obesity, and I think even COPD was one of them, because people who go through childhood abuse are more likely to be smokers, which is really interesting to me. Doesn't mean that everyone is, right? We're not saying that there's a catch all. We just know that there's a higher tendency for that to happen with people who have had to go through these experiences. And sometimes we see with sexual assault victims and survivors, or sexual assault survivors, that sometimes they will purposely gain weight. And that is so that they can try to stop others from invading their territory. Not that that matters, right? Because we know that sexual predators don't have preferences in who they hurt. A lot of times when we see predators, it's more about a power issue than anything else. And so sometimes people, after they've been sexually abused, will gain extra weight to try to feel more protected themselves. And that's can lead to other really poor health outcomes for these people. We also have different family forms. So the nuclear family form used to be the majority family form, but I don't even know if it's the predominant one anymore. And this is where you have a heterosexual married couple and their children. And so I think they actually really should update some of the terminology that they use for family forms, because there's some terms that we're going to go through here that I think technically should be called nuclear family forms now, but the research isn't quite there yet. So here's what I was talking about. They have same-sex parent family forms. And I would now say in the zeitgeist where we are that same-sex parents families should be called nuclear families as well, where you have two parents taking care of their children. We also have blended families. So these are families that one or both families went through some sort of divorce and then remarried. We have single parent families where a single parent raises the family. We have intergenerational family forms. This is one of those family forms that is steadily increasing in our society. And this is where you have like children, parents, and then the parents' parents all in the same home, or even great-grandparents. Different cultures are really big on this, but I think even in American culture, we're starting to see families kind of drift into more intergenerational homes. I think one of the biggest events that started triggering this in families was the recession back in around like circa 2011, where a lot of people moved back in with their parents, or the parents had to move in with them. And because the recession was hitting everyone really hard, so everyone kind of sheltered in place together. We also have Extended Kid Network. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the show called Shameless, but that was kind of an example of Extended Kid Network in the very beginning of that show, where basically you have people who live close to each other or in the same home, or they're friends, and they share their resources so that they can survive. There's also other family forms that I haven't gotten into a whole lot quite yet. But it'll be really interesting to see as this research kind of evolves. And I would really love to learn about each of y'all's family forms that you came from. So parental alienation, this sometimes occurs during a divorce in a family unit with children. I know that specifically we've been talking a lot about marriage so far. That's because of a lot of research still thinks that that's a really big deal, which is interesting because a lot of families are moving toward cohabitation and they're still a family unit. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes the research as well. So when we talk about parental alienation, specifically, this is talking about a divorce in a family unit with children, but like through interpreting it on my end, I think this could also be just, a family that had lived together in cohabitation, but never technically, signed papers with the government to get married if they split up and they break up the family unit. And so this is when people try to turn their child or children against their former spouse or their former partner. And this is where they just badmouth the child, or not the child, but they badmouth their former spouse or partner. And it's really manipulative, and it's really, 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 really sad. And so I bet a lot of people in this class actually have had experiences with this one, and it may have really, really damaged them in some ways that hopefully that you'll find healing from. So we also have our unit learning objectives for school. So I want you to be able to distinguish between intelligence test and achievement test, because your author in our textbook did not do that very well. I also want you to be able to describe how schools typically use intelligence and achievement tests. I want you to be able to identify learning-related disabilities and supply the characteristics of each. I want you to be able to list and describe the different theories of intelligence. We're going to talk about a few different ones. I want you to be able to provide personal examples of where you've had intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I want you to be able to explain how functional behavior analysis and the PREMAC principle are used within the school and home environment. So we've kind of already gone over the PREMAC principle and the FBA, so I may skip through that in this section of the PowerPoint. All right, but first up, learning styles do not exist. They do not exist. So you must now head over to our Blackboard site, and I want you to watch this video in full. And then I want you to think about it, and then I want you to come back to perusal and talk about it with your peers. If you're an educator, this is super important that you understand there are no such thing as learning styles. It is a bunch of snake oil. It is not real. And so I want you to watch this and really think about it, because you will probably be pressured at some point in your life to tailor an education plan or a lesson plan to gear toward different learning styles of your students. And it is malarkey. There's no reason for you to do that, because they do not exist. So you should share this TED Talk with those people when they tell you that. So we're going to skip over this. I told you we already kind of talked about this. I'd like to go over it a few times in my in-person class so that people can see it. We've talked about all these beautiful things, and hopefully y'all can do it. Actually, let's go back. I did add one here that you don't have. So there's also a strategy that you can use is called non-contingent reinforcement. So for non-contingent reinforcement, this is just providing positive reinforcement without people having to work for it. So for example, when I worked with a client, in a behavioral consultation, they had a child who was running around naked anytime that they had people come over to their house. And so what almost any therapist should do, or typically does when they have new clients, is kind of get a schedule of the day. And so what we found was, like, when we were listening to the whole day, it didn't sound like the family spent a lot of time with this child. And so after we did the FBA, and we figured it was attention that the child was trying to seek, and not something else, we had the family do non-contingent reinforcement. And so what it was is we had them create this little worksheet thing. And when it was green, that was the time that they were having non-contingent reinforcement. When it was red, the time was over. And we basically just had the parent play with the kid for 15 minutes a day. Behavior stopped. The nakedness around the house when company came over completely stopped. And all it took was the parent spending 15 minutes with their kid and letting their kid choose what they did. And it really hurt my heart a lot when I saw that. But I mean, if we think about kind of the society that America is, that one of the things that America values is constant work, being super busy, and not making time a lot of times for the things that are actually important. So I think it's really important that we kind of keep that in our mind. If you choose to be a parent, or if you already are a parent, or if you end up being a caregiver for someone, that how powerful just 15 minutes can be with somebody. Hopefully it's more than that, but that will probably always stick with me, that behavioral consultation that we did. So we also have intelligence. Your book kind of drops the ball on this a little bit. It does talk about Charles Spearman and something called G. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So Charles Spearman, what he found is that in every test that you take, usually if we were in person and if I have a whiteboard, I would be drawing on the whiteboard to show you this. But in every family or in every test that we take, we have the test overlap with other tests. So no matter what test it is, if it's math and science, or it could be underwater basket weaving, it could be singing, like all these different things that you do, there's a portion that is associated with all those other things. So intercorrelations is that we do all these correlations, and we find that there's this construct that underlies every single test that a person could ever take. And so what Spearman found was that he believes that people have something called G, or the general mental ability. All right. And so when we talk about intelligence, I typically subscribe to an intelligence theory that is not presented in our book, so I won't present it to you. But when we define intelligence, it's really just how well your brain works. It has nothing to do with how smart you are. And that may be really, really confusing for some of you. And so if I were doing an intelligence test, the textbook talks about the WISC-5. So it takes about an hour, hour and a half to give a WISC-5. You get this book. If we were actually in person, I would take some volunteers up and I would IQ test you, and we kind of play along a little bit in front of the whole class, but we can't do that. But it tests things like working memory. So like a working memory task, how about, okay, everyone, you can drop your pencils down again. You're so tired of these memory things probably. But one of the things is if you can remember numbers in the order that they're given to you. So I'd be like 5, 9, 7, 3, 2, 8. Go ahead. And you'd have to write them, or you'd have to say them out loud. And then the person who's doing the IQ test for you would have to score the protocol to see how you did with your working memory. Other things are like your perceptual reasoning or your spatial reasoning, right? So being able to manipulate things in space. So like directions, and so we don't typically think of those things as what makes someone smart. We also have processing speed. So like for one of those things in the WISC-5, they have this really cool handout, and it has like animals and different objects, and a kid has a certain amount of time to cross out as many animals as they possibly can within that time frame, so that we can see how fast they process information. And so on one side of it, it has them in straight rows, but then when you flip on the other side, it has it all kind of randomly spaced around. And so through that, we see how fast they can potentially process information. So if you've ever taken the ASVAB, you know that they have processing speed things in there, and that's to see who can be fighter pilots. And so when we talk about G, we talk about IQ. IQ becomes important because in schools, at least, because that helps us determine if there are certain disabilities that children have or adolescents have that they may need some additional supports to be successful in. I always like to play the little clip from Forrest Gump. So the Forrest Gump clip is over into our Blackboard site that you can watch if you want. But in this clip, it talks about Forrest having a certain IQ level, right? And that he fell below it so that he couldn't go to the public schools. And so one of the reasons why I think this scene's so powerful is because that actually happened. People with disabilities were systematically discriminated against within school systems. And what happened was they would try to force them into a different school or into a different room, or to keep them separated from kids who were considered typical or advanced, and they would keep them away and not allow those kids to be educated in the same schools. And so they actually used the civil rights movement and everything that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and things did to get equal access to schools for people with disabilities. And so there's that Forrest Gump example that you can watch. So the WISC, we've already kind of talked about a little bit, but it stands for the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WISC. They have an adult version of this called the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Individual or Intelligence Scale. And so they're very similar. They take about the same amount of time to administer. And what they are is an individual intelligence test. So it's one-on-one. It comes with a booklet. The examiner actually has to read the words word for word. And then in some of the tasks, like one of the tasks is asking about just specific information. I don't think this is a test question, so I can ask it like, how many days are in the month of March, right? And then the examiner actually has to score it when you're right there. And one of the subtests of the WISC, it talks about basically being able to comprehend things about what to do. So there's different ways that you can score it, and you could get a 2-point response, a 1-point response, or a 0-point response. And the examiner has to keep doing it. I kind of make a little joke. So if you ever have me or end up having me in person instead of just online, if I ever say, tell me more, I'm actually making a joke in reference to the WISC or the Stanford Binet. And so once I started telling students this, I didn't realize how much I started doing it, because I would start telling my lifespan class, if I say tell me more, it's because in a protocol, if someone gives a 1-point response, a lot of times you have to query it. And query just means you have to say, tell me more. That's the only thing you say. You can't say anything else. And then you have to keep following the rules for how to score it. And so I started doing that, and then students just start busting out laughing when I say, tell me more in class, because I've been so ingrained to do these things that I do them a lot more than I mean to sometimes. So the WISC is not an achievement test like page 207 in your textbook makes it seem like it is. So an intelligence test tests how well your brain functions, essentially. An achievement test then tests how much you know. Okay, usually this is based, if in schools, this is based on what grade level a child is in. And so it's important to keep those apart, because when we look at some common disabilities, federal law allows for schools to make diagnoses of specific learning disabilities based off of 2 different things, and one of which is called the discrepancy model, where you give an intelligence test like the WISC, so you give it, and if they score a certain score on that, and then we give them an achievement test, and in this achievement test, if there's a significant discrepancy between what the IQ test says their brain should be able to do versus the achievement test, which is what they actually know, if that discrepancy is big enough, we'll say that the child has a specific learning disability. So for those of you who have had stats class, most IQ tests have a mean of 100, so mean is average, and a standard deviation of 15. So that just tells about how often scores deviate from the mean, about how much they deviate from the mean. So when we look at an intellectual disability, if a kid has a score of under 70 and they also have issues with adaptive behavior, so that's buttoning their own clothes, taking care of themselves, taking themselves to the bathroom, and basically functioning in their daily lives, then they may qualify for an intellectual disability. But with specific learning disabilities, typically what we see here is that a kid has an average IQ score of 100, and then they may be performing at like 72 with their achievement test. And so what that says is that that difference is so wide that something else must be going on in their brain. And so there's other ways that they diagnose specific learning disabilities now, like response to intervention. So it's response to intervention. Basically, they have a tiered approach. They screen all of the kids in the grade with what they call curriculum-based measurement, or CBMs. And then with those, there's one called letter identification. So with kindergartners, they would literally hold up and see how many letters that kids can identify within 1 minute, not in alphabetical order, but the actual letters. So it could be like R, or S, or B, or V, or T, or W. And then after that, they benchmark them and they see who needs additional support. So if they need additional supports based off of those results, then they go to what they call as tier 2, and they provide often like group interventions and things like that. So that might be the teacher at their desk and the teacher providing group reading instruction. If the kids in tier 2 do not respond to 2 evidence-based interventions that were applied with fidelity, so the teachers actually provided the intervention in the way that it was designed, then sometimes that either one can qualify them for a special education evaluation then, or depending on what state and what school district and which school, may qualify them for special education period. Okay, so we also learned about the triarchic theory of intelligence. It's really funny. I find this really funny because we're going to learn about this, and the person who developed this was Robert Sternberg, I think. Yeah, I mess up his name sometimes. Yeah, so it's Robert Sternberg. So we see his theory here with the triarchic theory of intelligence, but we also will learn about him again when we get into love. And he has a triangular theory of love. So I always kind of joke, I'm like, what is his deal with triangles? He really must love triangles. And, I fact checked myself today just to double check that it really is the same guy. And I looked through his Vita, and sure enough, it's intelligence and love and triangles. I think that should be his memoir name. So in his theory, there's 3 types of intelligence. And you write about this in the book, The Analytic. So this is being able to critically think about things. Creativity, which is the ability to produce and think imaginatively. And then practical, this is the street smarts. So this, in his theory, these are the 3 parts. The book added an extra one, which has not ever been a part of the theory before. So I don't know what she's doing. But she was just basically saying that he would say that for people to have successful lives or to be successfully intelligent, whatever that means, they must have these 3 different types of intelligence in order to do it. So the unfortunate thing is with this theory and then with the multiple intelligence theory, they actually don't have a whole lot of empirical support behind them. There's another model, which I told you all about earlier, called the CHC model, that is typically what we believe as what intelligence actually is. And so it's the one that has the most support behind it. And that's basically that we have crystallized and fluid intelligence, and we have an overall kind of intelligence quotient that we function by. And so we'll actually get more into crystallized and fluid intelligence as we move along. But if I was going to be brief, crystallized intelligence is the information that we gain across our lifespan. And so that typically goes up as we age. And then fluid intelligence is things like your working memory or your processing speed, where it's where you can manipulate information. So that goes up to a point in our life. And then once we hit a certain point, then it starts going back down as we age and as our brains deteriorate. So we have multiple intelligences. This one's really unfortunate and misapplied all the time. And so the person for this one is Howard Gardner. The book only actually lists a few of the multiple intelligences, and I'm going to go past them probably a little bit. And unfortunately, this is one of the most misapplied theories in psychology. This is actually what gave birth to learning styles. And Howard Gardner hates learning styles. He would scream, even though his theory itself doesn't really have a whole lot of empirical support for it either. And so with this theory, he actually worked with people with autism spectrum disorders who had specialized skills. So that typically these are people referred to as savants. And so if you've ever seen a show like Rain Man, or another show where, you have someone who is severely impaired, but then they have this really special skill. Not all people with autism spectrum disorders also have intellectual disability. Sometimes they are co-occurring, but they're not always co-occurring. But what he did was study these people with very specialized skills. So like, for example, someone could hear an entire Beethoven symphony and they could hear it once and recreate it on the piano immediately. That would be one of his skills. And so what Howard Gardner was looking at is, well, these are some pretty remarkable skills. How are these people not intelligent? And so if we go back to the meaning of intelligence, we think more globally as intelligence is of how your brain globally works, right? How it globally functions. And so what we'd say here is that some of these intelligences, because what they did is then people try to apply this theory to regular developing people or typical people, typically developing people. And it's kind of a nice, warm, fluffy thing. And they're like, oh, but you're special and you're special and which is true. People are special in their own ways, 100%. But it's not necessarily intelligence. And I think it's because people confuse intelligence with being smart, and they're not the same thing. They're absolutely not the same thing. Intelligence is just how your brain works. It has nothing to do with your work ethic or what you achieve or anything like that. It's primarily you get it from genetics. And people really hate when I say that, and I understand why. I understand why for sure, but the research shows that a lot of it's genetic. There are things that can happen that inhibit intelligence, like if someone drinks alcohol while they're pregnant and damages the baby's brain, or If someone is not spoken to at all during the sensitive period during language development, that might inhibit their verbal communication and things like that. There are nonverbal intelligence tests and intelligence tests that you can administer nonverbally, and they're different things. But we won't get that far into it. Yeah, you could actually take an entire class on intelligence testing. And for if you're going to go become a school psychologist or clinical psychologist, they often require a series of assessment courses, with intelligence tests being the first one, achievement and intelligence test being the second one, and socio-emotional assessment as the third class in that series. And so with this, this got way out of hand with the multiple intelligences. There's actually more than these. Once I checked, and they had like 23 different ones. One of them was like olfactory intelligence, which is intelligence in smelling. And so, like, as a person, I would argue that these are actually just skills, right? Some of these are just skills. It's not necessarily intelligence per se. I think that's just kind of a fluffy way that we can say that everyone matters. Well, let's just say everybody does matter in different ways, and they have different skills. It doesn't mean that we all have to be exactly the same. And intelligence is just a completely different thing that predicts a whole bunch of different outcomes. But I will stop rambling on that, because I will keep you all week if we keep talking about this. So I hope you have a great week. This is all I got for you. Please make sure you're talking with each other in the comments. Do not just say something you found something interesting, okay? That doesn't do anything to move conversation forward. So when you write in your comments, put your personal experiences or engage with people about their experiences. Just saying something, I just learned this is something new or something like that. That's great, and I love it. And if you're just telling me so that I know, that's great. But make sure you're getting other comments in there, at least 2 really high quality comments where you're sharing about your own experience, or you're interpreting it in a different way than we already talked about or the book talked about. And that's how you can be really successful, especially with trying to study for our next exam. All right. Hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you soon.